Listen carefully, because what I'm about to tell you was never meant for the public. For 80 years it was buried in locked archives, sealed testimonies, and whispered rumors passed only among a handful of survivors. Imagine stumbling into a remote valley in northern Spain and finding a family whose very existence felt like a curse, a lineage so warped by obsession, secrecy, and blood that medical experts would later call it the most endogamous line in documented European history. This is not folklore, it is not exaggeration, it is a record of what happens when purity becomes an idol and blood becomes a prison. Before we go further, I want to know, where are you watching this from? Tell me in the comments. Because when this story ends, the place you stand might not feel the same anymore. Now picture it. Asturias, Spain. Winter 1938. The land is carved with mountains, valleys that swallow sound, villages so cut off that the outside world forgets them. The Spanish Civil War rages in the distance, but here, time feels frozen. A young American war correspondent named McKinnon makes his way through these mountains, searching for survivors, searching for truth. What he finds does not belong in any war report. In a forgotten hamlet, he stumbles upon a family who speak in half-dead dialects, who live according to laws no church or government ever sanctioned. A family line born of 3 sisters who shared one husband, and behind that husband, a patriarch whose obsession twisted not just their lives but generations. That family was called Calderón, and in this house of stone and secrecy, a vision of pure blood became something monstrous. But before we descend into the valley with McKinnon, you need to understand the seed of the madness. It begins not with the sisters, not with their shared husband, but with the father who planted the idea. Don Aurelio Calderón. A man who looked at centuries of family records, births, marriages, deaths, scribbled in fading ink, and decided that mixing with outsiders was sin. He called it la pureza de sangre, the purity of blood. Understand this, Aurelio was not insane in the way we picture lunatics. He was calculated, meticulous, persuasive. He taught his daughters from childhood that they were different, nobler, chosen. He filled their heads with legends, that they were descended from Gothic kings, that their veins carried something divine, that outsiders would corrupt them. He convinced them that their limp, their pale eyes, their strange language were not deformities or isolations, but sacred marks of superiority. The Calderón sisters grew up in a mental fortress built by their father, brick by brick, until they could not see the world outside. But Aurelio faced a problem, the problem that haunts every bloodline obsessed with its own survival. He had no sons, only 3 daughters, Elena, Magdalena, and Esperanza. If they married outside, the purity he worshipped would be broken. If they never married, the bloodline would die. In his desperation, Aurelio chose a third option, one so disturbing that it would echo down generations. He would not let his daughters leave. Instead, he would bring in a single man, carefully chosen, who would marry all 3. And together, they would manufacture children who were not just heirs, but experiments in concentrated blood. That man was Rodrigo Calderón. On paper, a distant cousin. In reality, something far darker. And when he entered the valley, he carried not just a name, but a secret that turned the sisters' lives into a labyrinth of lies. And so, in the shadow of war, hidden from the eyes of church and state, the Calderón experiment began. What unfolded in that valley was not simply incest, it was not simply fanaticism, it was a generation, all machine of control, manipulation, and obsession with purity that twisted children before they could speak. A story that makes you ask, how far can belief go before it becomes horror? Now we step into that valley together. Keep listening, because from this point forward, every revelation drags you deeper, and once you hear it, you cannot unhear it. The winter of 1895 sealed the Calderón family inside their stone farmhouse like insects trapped in amber. Outside, snow buried the mountain paths, isolating them completely. Inside, Aurelio Calderón prepared to unveil the decision that had been gestating in his mind for years. He gathered his 3 daughters, Elena, 22, sharp-eyed and obedient, Magdalena, 20, softer and questioning, and Esperanza, 18, restless and troubled. In the flickering light of a fire that spat shadows against the walls, he announced what he called their sacred duty. The sisters would not marry outsiders. They would not dilute the bloodline with villagers or peasants. Instead, they would share a single husband, a man Aurelio claimed was their distant cousin, Rodrigo Calderón, whom he had located in Santander. Rodrigo, he told them, was of the same noble lineage, his blood traced back through generations to the same Gothic ancestors. This, Aurelio insisted, was the perfect solution. Their bloodline would continue, undiluted, strengthened, purified. Elena, groomed since childhood to be her father's confidant, accepted immediately. She looked at her father's genealogical charts, maps of blood written in fading ink, and nodded like a disciple receiving Holy Scripture. Magdalena hesitated. She wondered aloud if perhaps God did not intend for them to live so cut off, so rigidly bound by one man's obsession. But Aurelio silenced her with rhetoric he had sharpened over decades. God rewards purity. God despises mixture. To marry outside was sin. To marry within was divine duty. And the youngest, Esperanza, her limp always cast as a sacred mark, felt the horror most deeply. She protested, pleaded, begged her sister to question. But her words were drowned in Aurelio's iron certainty. Weeks later, Rodrigo arrived. He was 35, weathered, with hollow eyes, and the hard calluses of a man who had known work and suffering. Yet there was something unsettling about him, something the sisters noticed in silence but could not name. A resemblance to Aurelio himself. The same grey eyes, the same narrow features, the same stillness that made silence feel heavier than words. The arrangement began as ritual. Aurelio officiated himself, muttering a grotesque hybrid of Catholic prayers and what he claimed were ancestral rites. There were no priests, no papers, no recognition from law or church, just a father sealing his daughters into a cycle of controlled reproduction. Elena, as eldest, was given first claim to Rodrigo. A month later, Magdalena. A month later, Esperanza. Then back again. A rotation of wombs, each tasked with producing offspring of pure Calderón stock. But truth, like rot, eventually seeps through walls. Rodrigo's tongue betrayed him. In the stillness of evenings, when stories were told by the fire, he spoke of places near the valley that no distant cousin should have known so well. He recalled events from decades past with too much intimacy. He laughed like Aurelio. He watched the sisters like Aurelio. And though none dared say it aloud, Magdalena began to suspect what Esperanza would later confirm. Rodrigo was not a distant cousin at all. One night, Esperanza uncovered the hidden letters beneath Aurelio's mattress, letters written decades earlier by Aurelio's own sister Carmen. She had died in childbirth, birthing a son whose father had never been named. That son was Rodrigo, which meant this man, now cycling through marriages with all three Calderón sisters, was not a cousin, but their half-brother, Aurelio's son. The deception was deliberate. The forged documents, meticulous. Aurelio had not just bent truth, he had annihilated it. In his mind, this was no crime, no incest, no abuse. He called it genetic refinement, the mixing of his own blood with itself again and again until no foreign trace remained. Do you see the psychology here? This was more than survival, it was control. Aurelio had built a system where even biology bent to his obsession. His daughters were not individuals with futures, but instruments, vessels for his idea. The family was not family anymore. It was an experiment, a breeding program disguised as sacred duty. And once the cycle began, it would not stop. Rodrigo accepted his role like a man resigned to fate. Elena became his shadow, intoxicated by the illusion of being chosen. Magdalena doubted, but lacked the strength to rebel. Esperanza saw the truth and recorded it in secret, but even her awareness could not save her. Because once you are inside a machine built to control every breath, escape becomes almost impossible. The first children would arrive soon, and with them the proof of Aurelio's obsession, and the beginning of something even darker, The snow thawed in the spring of 1897, but the Calderón Valley remained frozen in its own secret season. Within months, the sisters' bellies began to swell. Aurelio's design was working exactly as he intended. To the outside world, nothing appeared unusual. The family was too isolated, too cut off for anyone to notice. But inside those stone walls, a dark anticipation grew. Each pregnancy was a victory for Aurelio. Each womb, a vessel to prove his doctrine of blood. By autumn, the first generation of Calderón children entered the world. Elena delivered twins, a boy and a girl she named Alonso and Concepcion. Magdalena bore a daughter, Carmen, named after the aunt whose secret life and letters had set this nightmare in motion. The births were brutal. There were no doctors, no midwives, no nurses. Aurelio himself presided as midwife. Hands that had laid stone now pulling infants into a world already sealed with destiny. The air reeked of blood and smoke from the fire that sterilized his knives. Outside, snow fell again, as if the valley itself wished to bury what was happening inside. At first the children seemed like any others, but as days turned into months, subtle differences began to surface. All three bore the Calderón mark, the piercing grey eyes, uncanny in their intensity. But they also carried something else. Alonso had a jaw malformed by a severe underbite, his speech garbled even as he learned his first words. Concepcion's fingers were webbed with strands of skin between the knuckles, a sign of developmental anomaly. Carmen, though outwardly the most normal, failed to respond to sound. She was nearly deaf, forced to learn through hand signals. These were not random quirks. They were the inevitable outcome of Aurelio's obsession, genes folding inward, recombining too tightly, weakening even as they concentrated. But Aurelio did not see deformity. He saw refinement. He pointed to their grey eyes as proof of purity. He claimed the abnormalities were signs of divine selection, markers of their superiority. Where others would see limitation, he insisted on destiny. And the children, they grew inside this philosophy like plants twisted toward poisoned light. By the time they were toddlers, Alonso, Concepcion, and Carmen displayed a strange seriousness. They did not laugh easily. They did not play like normal children. Instead, they spent hours staring at the family genealogical charts that Aurelio kept nailed to the walls, their small fingers tracing names they could barely pronounce. They repeated bloodlines like prayers, memorizing combinations, calculating ancestry before they even understood the concept of numbers. Esperanza, the youngest sister, watched with dread. She saw how Aurelio's ideology was not just written in ink or sealed in ritual. It was etched into these children's minds before they could form independent thought. They did not ask why. They asked only who and from whom. Already they understood themselves not as individuals, but as branches of a single tree that Aurelio demanded remain unbroken, unmixed. Magdalena noticed it too, but she buried her fear. She told herself that perhaps the children would grow into their abnormalities, that perhaps God would make right what man had twisted. Elena, however, leaned deeper into her father's creed. She recorded the children's traits meticulously, charting their growth like a scientist with test subjects. For her, Aurelio's vision was no longer an idea. It was reality embodied in her own offspring. And Rodrigo, the husband, the half-brother, the reluctant instrument of all this, he sank into silence. He performed his duties, moved from sister to sister, fathered child after child. His eyes were hollow, but his body obeyed. In the rare moments he spoke, it was to Aurelio, not the sisters. He had become more shadow than man, an extension of the patriarch's will. By 1905, 8 children filled the farmhouse. The walls rang not with laughter, but with the sound of memorized genealogies, whispered calculations of who should breed with whom when the time came. Aurelio was aging now, his breath heavy, his body weakening, but he looked upon those children as his triumph. He had built not a family, but a machine, and soon he intended to pass control of that machine to them. What began as Aurelio's twisted dream was becoming self-sustaining. The children were not resisting, they were embracing, and Esperanza realized the truth with horror. The real prison was not the valley, it was the mind. The second generation was already preparing to continue the cycle, not out of obedience, but out of belief. By the turn of the century, the Calderón Valley had become a world within itself, a kingdom of one family where every birth, every ritual, every whispered word served Aurelio's singular obsession. But time is the one enemy no man can outwit. His hair, once black as coal, grew white. His back bent beneath the weight of his years. His lungs rattled in the night. Yet even as his body betrayed him, his mind only sharpened. He knew he would not live forever, and so he began shaping heirs to continue what he had started. Alonso, the malformed boy with the underbite, was the chosen successor, barely 10 years old, yet already treated like a patriarch in training. Aurelio called him mi heredero, my heir, not grandson. He trained the boy at night, seated across the kitchen table, candlelight dancing on their grey eyes. While other children might have learned fables or arithmetic, Alonso was drilled in charts of bloodlines, equations of kinship, theories of refinement. He grew up believing his jaw, his very deformity, was proof of superior concentration of blood, that his weakness was strength. The other children were not exempt. Concepcion, webbed fingers hidden under sleeves, was taught to see herself as a vessel. Her role was not to live, but to breed. Carmen, deaf but perceptive, was praised as possessing a purer silence, a soul uncorrupted by the noise of outsiders. Each child was told the same lie, that their difference was not flaw, but destiny, that their abnormalities were sacred signs of chosen blood, and children, hungry for meaning, swallowed poison when it was given as sacrament. By 1910, the farmhouse had transformed into something monstrous, part school, part church, part breeding hall. The walls were covered not with saints or scripture, but with family trees that stretched like roots and branches, drawn over and over until they became the children's universe. They were told who would pair with whom when they came of age. They were told which cousins would bear which sacred unions, and they accepted it without question. Why? Because they had never known anything else. Isolation is the perfect soil for control. The Calderón children had no playmates, no teachers, no priests from outside. Their entire vocabulary of morality was defined by Aurelio. What others might call sin, they called duty. What others might call abuse, they called sacrifice. There were no outside voices to pierce the illusion, no witness to say, this is wrong, and so the lie became truth. Esperanza, the only sister who still fought internally against the nightmare, recorded everything in her hidden journals. She documented each child's birth defect, each ritual Aurelio devised, each chilling conversation where the children began to speak of breeding as though it were a holy calling. She wrote in secret, hoping that someday the record might escape, even if she never could. But the pages grew heavier with each year, because she knew that while she wrote, the cycle deepened. Aurelio's health worsened by 1915. His coughs shook the farmhouse. His nights grew long, his eyes sunken. And so he made his final arrangements. Alonso, not yet 15, was to become the family's patriarch. His cousins and sisters were to become his wives. The system would not die with Aurelio, it would grow stronger without him. He believed he had done what all great tyrants dream of. He had created an ideology that would live without its founder, a prison that policed itself. When Alonso reached puberty, his role was sealed. He stood before the family with his father's genealogical charts and declared his eagerness to fulfill his destiny. He would take his sisters and cousins as wives, continue the bloodline, and perfect what Aurelio had begun, and the others, they applaud. Children applauding their own chains. It was no longer just Aurelio's madness, it was theirs. By the time Aurelio finally collapsed into death, the valley was not free. It was enslaved to an idea so powerful it had infected every mind. The patriarch's body rotted in the cold earth, but his doctrine lived, pulsing in the hearts of children who no longer needed him. And that is when the second generation took control of the machine, not by force, but by belief. They were not victims anymore. They were disciples. The year was 1917, and Aurelio Calderón's bones were barely settled in the frozen soil when the second generation stepped forward to claim his throne of obsession. The farmhouse no longer felt like a home, it had become a shrine to la pureza de sangre, where every object, every ritual, every glance carried the weight of Aurelio's will. His genealogical charts, once his personal fixation, were now treated as scripture. His journals, stained with ink and cough spittle, were read aloud like sermons. His voice, though silenced in death, ruled louder than ever. Alonso was the center of it all, 15 years old, jaw twisted by deformity, yet filled with the certainty of a king. Aurelio had groomed him well. He believed he was not just the heir to the Calderón bloodline, but the very instrument of its perfection. The others reinforced this belief, because belief was the only currency they knew. His sisters and cousins spoke to him with reverence. They looked at him not as a boy, but as a vessel of destiny. Even his defects were praised, his lisp, his struggle to chew, his strange gait, all interpreted as divine marks of concentrated purity. By 1919, the first unions of the second generation had begun. Alonso claimed his cousin Concepcion, the girl with the webbed fingers. Rodrigo, older now and nearly broken, officiated like a hollow priest. The ritual was grotesque in its familiarity, the same hybrid of Catholic prayers and ancestral chants Aurelio had invented, now repeated by children who believed they were ancient truths. To them, nothing felt unnatural. To them, it was not incest, not violation. It was honor. And soon, the cycle widened. Cousins paired with cousins, sisters rotated through brothers. The logic was mechanical, every pairing calculated against Aurelio's charts, every birth tracked like an experiment, the farmhouse filled with cries of infants who were not mistakes but proof, living evidence that the system was alive and self-sustaining. The Calderons were now their own nation, their own church, their own prison. Esperanza, older now and weary, watched with despair. She had once dreamed of escape. She had once believed she could break the chain. But she realized the truth. The prison was sealed not by walls, but by the mind. These children did not wish to leave. They did not even imagine another world. They believed outsiders were dangerous, tainted, inferior. They believed their mission was sacred. To them, this valley was not isolation. It was destiny. The genetic consequences grew more obvious with each new child. Some were born with twisted spines, some with clouded eyes, some with fragile bones that broke too easily. Yet each defect was reinterpreted, rebranded as a sign of refinement. Where others would have seen suffering, the Calderón saw glory. The children who could not walk were described as spiritually elevated. Those who could not hear were praised for their inner silence. Those who were malformed were treated as chosen vessels. Aurelio's poison lived on in every interpretation. Nothing could be a flaw if the doctrine said it was sacred. And still, the second generation bred. They were relentless. They were obedient to their dead patriarch's vision. By 1925, 3 generations lived within the farmhouse, their family tree not branching outward, but folding inward, tighter and tighter, until it resembled a knot. Tangled, suffocating, impossible to untie. But here is the horror that goes beyond blood and bone. The psychological conditioning was so complete that no one resisted, no one questioned. To resist would mean betraying Aurelio, betraying the sacred order, betraying God himself. They lived under a spell so deep that even their deformities became fuel for faith. The valley had become a laboratory of control, a closed loop, a genetic echo chamber. No priests, no officials, no villagers dared step too close. Rumors spread in nearby hamlets, whispers of strange children, strange tongues, strange rituals, but the mountains kept the secrets sealed, and so the Calderón lineage spiraled deeper into itself, generation after generation. A family that no longer resembled family but a machine designed to concentrate blood until nothing human remained. Esperanza's journals swelled with pages. She wrote by candlelight, documenting each birth, each ritual, each child who entered the world with marks of Aurelio's obsession. She knew her words might never escape the valley, but she wrote anyway, as though some future eye might read them and understand. What she did not know was that decades later, one man, an outsider, an American journalist, would stumble into this valley and unearth everything she had recorded. His name was Thomas McKinnon, and his discovery would haunt him until the day he died. But before we meet him, we must go deeper still, into the rituals, the psychology, and the growing darkness that consumed the Calderón children as they became adults. By the 1930s, the Calderóns no longer needed Aurelio's ghost to guide them. His teachings had crystallized into ritual. What began as one man's obsession was now religion, enforced not by fear of punishment, but by the certainty of belief. The rituals grew elaborate. Each union between cousins or siblings was preceded by a liturgy of genealogical recitation. Children memorized entire bloodlines and chanted them aloud in the candlelit hall, voices rising like a choir. The ceremony ended with Aurelio's most chilling decree, spoken as prayer: La sangre no debe salir del valle. The blood must not leave the valley. Alonso, now the patriarch, no longer looked like a boy. His twisted jaw and drooping eye made him a grotesque figure, yet to the family he was saintly. His word was law. He enforced Aurelio's codes with precision: who would pair, when they would pair, how their children would be raised. But Alonso was not a tyrant in the traditional sense. He did not need to command by fear. The family policed itself. Sisters reported brothers, mothers corrected daughters, cousins whispered warnings. To question was unthinkable. To resist was betrayal of blood. Outsiders were demons in their doctrine. Children grew up believing that a single marriage to a stranger would destroy centuries of sanctity. When a wandering shepherd once trespassed into the valley, Alonso declared it a test. The man disappeared. His body was never found. Esperanza, frail and aging, continued her secret writing. But the family no longer listened to her doubts. They regarded her as weak, even sinful, for questioning Aurelio's sacred plan. She was a relic of hesitation in a house that demanded certainty. The Calderóns had become something Aurelio never dared to name, a cult bound not by chains but by blood that worshipped itself. By the 1940s, the Calderón farmhouse echoed with the cries of a third generation. Babies came in quick succession, delivered by cousins barely out of childhood themselves. Each birth was marked with ritual: prayers to Aurelio, incense burned before the genealogical charts, blood from the umbilical cord smeared across the family Bible as a seal of loyalty. What should have been moments of tenderness were transformed into ceremonies of doctrine. The children of this new brood bore the marks of a lineage folding in upon itself. Some were born with club feet, others with cleft palates that split their cries into shrieks. A few had eyes that never opened, cloudy and blind. Yet within the family's warped theology, each defect was celebrated. A clubfoot meant stability of root. A cleft palate meant voice of the ancestors. Blindness was revered as inner vision. Every weakness was reinterpreted into holiness. More disturbing was their devotion. From the earliest age, the third generation displayed no hesitation, no doubt. They grew up reciting genealogies before they could walk. They memorized Aurelio's commandments as nursery rhymes. When a child refused to eat, older siblings reminded them it was for the purity of blood, and the child obeyed. No lash, no punishment, only the weight of belief, crushing and complete. Alonso, now aging into his 30s, presided like a monarch. His body bent further with deformity, yet the children kissed his twisted hands as though touching relics. Concepcion, his cousin wife, bore child after child until her body broke, and still the family praised her as a martyr of blood. Esperanza, nearly 60, wrote furiously, her journals swollen with testimony, but she knew now the truth. The Calderóns no longer needed Aurelio. His dream had metastasized. The third generation did not inherit a curse. They embraced it as destiny. By the early 1950s, silence could no longer contain the Calderón Valley. Rumors trickled outward, carried by traders, shepherds, and the occasional brave soul who skirted too close to the farmhouse. In nearby villages, people whispered of children with too many fingers, of siblings who spoke in strange cadences, of a family that did not marry but multiplied itself. Mothers frightened their children into obedience with a single phrase: "Behave, or the Calderóns will take you." The isolation that had protected the clan for decades was fraying. Roads pushed deeper into the mountains, soldiers passed through on patrol, and census takers began asking questions. Outsiders saw only glimpses: a woman with webbed hands drawing water from a well, a boy with mismatched eyes staring from the tree line. Each sighting deepened the rumors until Los Calderón became a legend of horror, half folklore, half fact. Inside the valley, Alonso raged at the intrusion. He declared the family must remain unseen, hidden until the world forgot them again. The children were forbidden from straying near the ridges. Crops were planted further inward. Their rituals, once loud and celebratory, became hushed, performed behind barred shutters. Yet secrecy only sharpened their devotion. The less the world saw of them, the more convinced they became of their divine separateness. Esperanza saw danger in the whispers. She understood that attention meant exposure, and exposure meant collapse. But when she warned Alonso, he dismissed her. "They speak of us as monsters," he said, "because they envy us. They are impure. We are chosen." The valley tightened its walls, but outside eyes were watching, and among them was one man who would not let the whispers fade. An American journalist named Thomas McKinnon. Thomas McKinnon was not searching for monsters. He was searching for stories. A war correspondent turned cultural journalist, he had spent years chasing legends in forgotten corners of the world. In 1957, while stationed in Mexico City, he heard the whispers, a hidden family in the northern Sierras, sealed off from the world, breeding only with themselves. At first, he dismissed it as peasant folklore, but when he saw a tattered local newspaper clipping, an obituary for a child of notable deformity belonging to the Calderón family, his curiosity sharpened into obsession. McKinnon's first journey into the valley took weeks. He bribed a mule driver to guide him through half-forgotten mountain passes, bribed again for silence. The guide abandoned him 2 ridges away, refusing to step closer. "The blood there is cursed," the man muttered. McKinnon pressed on alone. The valley revealed itself slowly, a sweep of maize fields, a river cutting through black rock, and at the center a farmhouse too large for its purpose. Smoke curled from its chimneys. He saw children moving between the fields, bent-backed, heavy-headed, some walking with sticks though they were no older than 10. At first glance they seemed sickly, but when they noticed him, their movements changed. They stood straight, stiff and silent, watching. McKinnon introduced himself at the door, his Spanish fluent but foreign. Alonso, now in his 50s and wearing the authority of a patriarch, received him coldly. His twisted jaw barely moved as he spoke. "There is nothing here for you," Alonso said. Yet McKinnon was not turned away. Curiosity cut both ways. The Calderóns had never welcomed an outsider, but they were eager to measure him, this stranger who dared approach their sanctuary. Esperanza, frail and half-forgotten, saw him and felt something crack inside her chest. For 50 years she had prayed for a witness. Now one had arrived. McKinnon was given a narrow cot in a side room of the farmhouse. He suspected it was not hospitality but surveillance. Every corner of the Calderón home seemed to have eyes. Children lingered in doorways, cousins whispered in unison, and at night he heard footsteps pacing the hall outside his door. Yet he stayed, notebook hidden in his satchel, pen scratching when no one listened. The first days were tense. Alonso introduced him to the family not as a guest, but as an intruder tolerated for study. Meals were silent affairs. Bowls of beans, maize, and goat's milk passed hand to hand. The family ate with a peculiar reverence, as though the food itself were part of a ritual. When McKinnon asked about religion, Alonso replied, "We do not follow the church. We follow the blood." It was Esperanza who broke the silence. Late one night, when the house slept, she crept into his room with a bundle of papers tied in string. Her hands trembled as she placed them on his cot. "Write it down," she whispered in broken English. "They will never let you leave. But if you do, take this. The truth must live." Then she vanished before he could answer. The bundle contained journals, decades of entries written in her careful hand. He read by candlelight, heart hammering, as Aurelio's voice re-emerged through her testimony, his charts, his doctrines, the forced unions, the births marked as victories of purity. Every page confirmed what rumor had only hinted. The next morning, McKinnon watched the family gather for a ritual. Candles burned before Aurelio's portrait. Names were recited, unions arranged. He realized with a shudder, he was not observing an old tradition. He was watching a living experiment, still unfolding, still tightening its noose. McKinnon filled his notebooks feverishly, pretending to sketch landscapes while capturing every detail of the Calderón rites. What he saw chilled him more than any battlefield he had reported from. The rituals were not superstition in decay. They were precise, rehearsed, alive. One evening he was permitted to observe what Alonso called la consagración de la sangre. The family gathered in a long room lit by candles set into the walls. At the front stood Aurelio's portrait, its surface darkened by decades of smoke. Alonso presided, his twisted face glowing in the candlelight, his voice a cracked chant. The ceremony began with the children. One by one, they stepped forward to recite their lineage. Not parents and grandparents, but cousins, uncles, siblings, collapsing names into a knot that circled endlessly back upon itself. The recitations were flawless, memorized like scripture. McKinnon realized these children could not name a single saint or national hero, but they could trace bloodlines backward for 7 generations. Then came the unions. A boy of 16 was paired with a girl of 14, cousins, though in truth there was no longer any distinction. Alonso declared their bond sacred. The pair touched foreheads, and the family murmured in unison, "La sangre no debe salir del valle." The blood must not leave the valley. McKinnon wrote every word, but he knew he was being watched. A cousin lingered behind him, eyes sharp, as though weighing the pages of his notebook. He began to sense the trap. He was not a guest, nor merely an observer. He was a variable, a potential contaminant. That night, Esperanza returned. Her whisper was urgent, almost frantic. "They will not release you. If they doubt you, they will keep you, forever." McKinnon began planning his escape in silence. He mapped the ridges in his notebook, counted the hours between Alonso's patrols of the fields, noted which cousins carried knives at their belts. He told himself he would slip away before dawn, journals hidden beneath his coat. But the more he watched, the more he realized the bars of the Calderón prison were not iron, they were minds. One night, he saw it plainly. A boy of 10 had spoken out of turn, asking if one day he might see the nearest town. Before Alonso could reply, 2 older cousins seized him. They dragged the child to the center of the hall and forced him to recite the bloodline until his throat broke into sobs. The family watched in silence. The punishment was not cruelty, it was correction, delivered by children to children. No whip, no order, only the weight of doctrine pressing down until obedience returned. McKinnon wrote furiously in the dark, his hands shaking. These children were not victims in the way outsiders imagined. They were enforcers, priests in miniature, carrying Aurelio's gospel deeper into each generation. The valley no longer needed a patriarch to hold it together. It was self-sustaining, self-punishing. Esperanza's warnings grew more desperate. She told him of others, wanderers, shepherds, even a census clerk who had entered and never returned. "They bury them in the fields," she whispered. "Roots grow over the bones." McKinnon tried to ask how she herself had survived her doubts. She only lifted her frail hands and said, "Because I write. It is all I have." The thought gnawed at him. If they discovered his notebooks, he would not leave the valley alive. Yet he could not stop writing. To record was to resist, and resistance was his only weapon. McKinnon's presence, at first tolerated as curiosity, soon became a fracture line. The Calderóns were not accustomed to outsiders, and the longer he remained, the more each branch of the family cast him in a different light. To Esperanza, he was deliverance. She began slipping him more journals, pages smuggled from beneath floorboards and false drawers. Her handwriting grew frantic, filled with pleas. "Take this. Take it far. Let them be known." She saw in McKinnon the witness she had prayed for across decades of silence. To Alonso, however, McKinnon was no longer a threat of exposure. He was an opportunity. During a ritual meal, Alonso rose to speak, his jaw twisting with every syllable. "This man has been sent to us. The blood calls him. He comes not to destroy, but to join." A murmur rippled through the cousins. To Alonso's mind, there was no outsider. There were only those who had not yet been absorbed. The younger Calderóns echoed their patriarch. McKinnon caught their stares, wide, unblinking, hungry. He realized with a jolt they were not plotting his murder. They were plotting his assimilation. His foreign blood, his outsider's seed, would be grafted into the lineage, sanctified as a divine correction to their deformities. That night, Esperanza found him again. Her whisper trembled. "They will bind you to one of the girls. It is how they will keep you. You will not leave as yourself." McKinnon's resolve hardened. Escape was no longer a vague plan. It was necessity. He began hiding supplies, wrapping Esperanza's journals in oilcloth, memorizing the path of the river out of the valley. Yet he knew the Calderons were watching, always watching, and if Alonso truly intended to bind him by blood, time was running out. The announcement came during a night of heavy rain, when the Calderons gathered in the long hall to renew their vows of blood. Candles guttered against the damp, smoke curling around Aurelio's darkened portrait. McKinnon sat at the edge, notebook hidden beneath his coat, his every nerve alert. Alonso rose, crooked and trembling, yet radiant in the candlelight. His voice cut through the storm. "Tonight we receive not only blessings from our ancestors, but a gift sent into our valley. This man," his twisted hand gestured toward McKinnon, "has been chosen." The family murmured as one, a low hum like bees in a hive. Alonso's gaze burned. "The blood has called him. He will not leave us. He will join us. His seed will strengthen the root." McKinnon felt the air collapse around him. A girl was brought forward, 16, perhaps younger, her features already marked by the family's lineage, broad forehead, one lazy eye. She did not resist. She seemed almost exalted, as though this union were the fulfillment of a prophecy. Esperanza's eyes across the hall filled with helpless terror. She shook her head once, a warning he understood. Refusal meant death. The cousins pressed closer, encircling him. The girl knelt at his side, her hands trembling but eager. Alonso intoned the words, "La sangre no debe salir del valle." The blood must not leave the valley. The family echoed it in unison, a chant that grew louder with every repetition. McKinnon's mind raced. Flight seemed impossible, yet surrender meant erasure, his name absorbed, his body shackled to the very system he had come to expose. He glanced at Esperanza, who clutched her shawl as if hiding something within. In that fleeting look, he knew, if he were to escape, she would be his only ally. The night after the announcement, McKinnon pretended compliance. He ate in silence, bowed his head during their chants, even allowed the girl chosen for him to sit at his side. The family's suspicion seemed to ease, but his stomach churned with every moment. He was no longer an observer. He was prey being fattened for ritual. Esperanza slipped into his room past midnight. From beneath her shawl, she drew a small parcel wrapped in cloth, dried maize cakes, a water skin, and a stub of candle. But it was the final object she pressed into his palm that nearly undid him, a brass key. "For the side gate," she whispered. "Alonso never changed the lock. If you go, you must go before the next moon. After, they will bind you. You will not leave alive." McKinnon's pulse thundered. He had mapped the valley, memorized the river's curve, the direction of the mountain pass, yet fear gnawed at him, fear not of capture, but of becoming what they wanted. He imagined the chants swallowing his name, his bloodlines rewritten until history itself forgot him. The following day, the Calderón children shadowed him more closely than ever. Their wide, unblinking stares followed him from room to field. One boy, no older than 12, whispered as he passed, "The blood knows when it is about to be tested." That night, McKinnon tucked Esperanza's journals under his coat, the brass key hidden in his boot. He waited until the farmhouse stilled, the candles burned low, and the cousins' chanting dwindled into snores. His hand hovered on the key, slick with sweat. If he failed, he would be buried in those fields. If he succeeded, the world would finally hear the Calderón name in all its horror. McKinnon slipped into the night like a thief. The farmhouse groaned in its sleep, beams creaking as rain drummed the roof. He padded down the corridor, the journals pressed tight against his chest, Esperanza's key heavy in his boot. Every shadow felt alive, every silence charged. At the side gate, he fumbled with the lock, hands shaking. The brass teeth caught, turned, and with a dull click, the rusted bolt gave way. For the first time since entering the valley, he felt air that was not Calderón air. He nearly ran, but forced himself to move slowly. crouching low as he slipped into the maize fields. The river's distant rush guided him. He was halfway down the slope when a sound froze him, one long, low horn echoing through the valley, then another. The Calderons were awake. Candles flared in the farmhouse. Shadows swarmed into the fields, spreading with uncanny coordination. Voices chanted through the dark, not panicked but measured, as though the hunt itself was another ritual. La sangre no debe salir del valle, they intoned, again and again, their voices carrying on the wind. McKinnon stumbled through wet soil, his notebook slapping against his chest. He slid down a ridge, tearing his hands on rock. Behind him he saw them, dozens of figures fanning out across the valley, torches in hand. Children ran ahead like hounds, their pale faces glowing in the firelight. He waded into the river, the cold biting through his bones. The current tugged at his legs, threatening to drag him under, but he pressed forward. Over the roar of water, he heard Alonso's voice rise above the chants. "Bring him back, alive!" The hunt was not for blood, it was for absorption. The river was no ally. Its current pulled with the strength of a living thing, dragging McKinnon downstream, slamming him against hidden rocks. Water filled his nose and mouth, threatening to choke the breath from him. He clutched the bundle of journals high against his chest, refusing to let them be swept away. To lose them was to lose everything, the evidence, Esperanza's voice, the proof of what the valley had become. Behind him, the torches multiplied. The Calderón children were already at the banks, shrieking with glee as they plunged into the water. Their thin limbs cut through the current with terrifying ease. They had grown in this river, bred to endure its pull. McKinnon realized they were faster than him. He forced himself onto a half-submerged boulder, coughing up river water. For a moment he thought it was the end. Then he saw her. Esperanza stood on the opposite bank, a small figure wrapped in her shawl, barely visible in the stormlight. Her frail arms lifted, pointing toward a gap in the ridge, a hidden path McKinnon had not marked. He slid back into the water, following her signal. The chants behind him rose louder, rhythmic, almost triumphant. La sangre no debe salir del valle. The phrase pounded in time with his heartbeat. Esperanza did not move. She stood as the torches closed in, the cousins surrounding her like wolves. Alonso's voice carried above the din, sharp with rage. "What have you done?" McKinnon reached the far bank, dragging himself into the mud, the journals still clutched to his chest. He looked back once, just once, in time to see Esperanza lower her head in surrender as the family encircled her. Her choice was clear. She had given him her escape, at the cost of her own. McKinnon clawed up the ridge, mud caking his hands, the journals slung tight under his arm. Every muscle screamed, but he dared not slow. Below him, the valley boiled with firelight, torches weaving through the fields, voices rising in unison. The chants followed him up the slope, relentless, as if the earth itself were reciting, "La sangre no debe salir del valle." His boots slipped on wet stone. He fell, skinned his knee raw, scrambled upward again. The ridge loomed like a wall, but beyond it, he knew, lay the outer road, the line where the Calderón name no longer ruled. Freedom, or at least the chance to be heard. Behind him came the hunters. Children bounded up the slope like creatures born of the dark, their shrill cries carrying over the storm. Adults followed, slower but steady, their torches marking the climb. Alonso's voice rose above all, cracked but commanding. "Do not let him leave. The blood must take him." McKinnon's chest burned. He thought of Esperanza, her quiet strength, her trembling hands passing him the key, the journals, the final signal toward this hidden path. He thought of her standing in surrender as the circle closed around her. If he failed now, her sacrifice would rot unremembered in that valley. A jagged ledge jutted ahead. He dragged himself over it, lungs heaving, fingernails tearing. The chants seemed to fade for a moment, replaced by the hollow rush of wind from the outer pass. For the first time, he smelled pine instead of maize. He stumbled forward, half-blind, clutching the journals like scripture. The valley roared behind him, but the path ahead was open. One more step and he would carry their secret into the world. At dawn, McKinnon staggered onto the high road. The storm had passed, leaving the sky raw and pale, the air sharp with pine. Behind him the valley crouched in mist, its torches extinguished, its chants swallowed by distance. For the first time in weeks he was beyond the reach of Calderón hands, yet freedom did not feel like triumph. It felt like exile. He collapsed by the roadside, clutching the bundle of journals. Pages were soaked, ink blurred, but the words remained. Esperanza's voice lived within them. He turned one page at random and read her cramped scrawl. If the valley dies in silence, then Aurelio wins forever. A mule driver passed hours later and found him half-conscious. To the driver, McKinnon must have looked like any other lost traveler, gaunt and mud-smeared, clutching a bundle as if it were his child. The man offered bread, water, a ride toward the nearest town. McKinnon accepted, though his gaze never left the mist that cloaked the valley below. Days later, in a city loud with bells and traffic, he sat alone in his rented room. The journals lay spread before him. He knew what they meant. A story that could shatter a nation's sense of itself, a truth too grotesque to ignore. Yet he also knew the Calderón reach, lawyers, allies, men who moved unseen in government and church. Publishing would not only damn the family, it would put his own name on their list. McKinnon stared at his typewriter. His fingers hovered above the keys. To strike the first letter would be to unleash Esperanza's voice, to honor her sacrifice, but it would also mark his own death sentence. The question remained, was the truth worth the cost of survival? McKinnon did not sleep that night. The journals lay open around him, the room littered with fragments of Esperanza's handwriting, the confessions of a valley that devoured its own. He read until his eyes burned, genealogies written like scripture, punishments recounted in trembling detail, the slow unraveling of a family bound tighter with each generation. Every page was a blade, cutting away his excuses. At dawn, he rolled a fresh sheet into the typewriter. His hands shook. The clack of the first key was deafening in the silence. Word by word he began, "The Calderón Valley is not on any map, but it exists." The words poured like blood. He wrote until his fingers cramped, until the room filled with the stench of ink and sweat. He was not just telling Esperanza's story. He was indicting a dynasty, piercing a secrecy that had lasted a century. By dusk, he stopped, staring at the stack of pages beside him. His body trembled with exhaustion, but the work was alive, undeniable. Somewhere deep inside, fear still whispered, "They will come for you." Yet above it, another voice answered. Esperanza's voice, steady, insistent. "If the valley dies in silence, then Aurelio wins forever." McKinnon gathered the pages, sealed them in a plain envelope, and addressed it to his editor in New York. At the post office, his hand hesitated only once before the clerk stamped it and slid it away. As he stepped back into the crowded street, the weight of the valley did not lift. He knew the Calderóns would never forgive, never forget. He would always feel their eyes in the shadows, but the silence was broken, and some curses once spoken aloud can never be sealed again.